Well, creeps, your girl is in Nashville.
All across the globe, cemeteries and historic buildings are disappearing. The histories and names of those buried there and who lived there are in threat of being lost forever. I am on a mission to tell their stories. This is Grave Hunter. We are here at City Cemetery in Nashville. This is the oldest public cemetery in Nashville. It's founded in 1822. There's over 22,000 people buried here, including 22 former mayors of Nashville and over 6,000 former slaves and freed African Americans. Clearly the number 22 has a lot to do with the cemetery. I don't know what that means. This place though is gorgeous. It is really early in the morning. There's a beautiful fog here. The atmosphere is insane. I can honestly say this cemetery feels different than any cemetery I've ever been in. There's a heaviness that I am unfamiliar with. That could be the age, that could be the nature of the lives of the people that are buried here. I'm not sure, but I am really, really excited to explore it.
Here's a fun fact I learned, and it's not something you'll hear pretty much anyone talk about in Nashville, but this isn't the original Nashville City Cemetery. This, in fact, is the new one. The original is underneath, get this, the Nissan football stadium. Yeah, many of the bodies were disinterred and moved to the cemetery, but when construction work was almost finished on the stadium, workers found bones and left them there.
So they have this really cool thing here at the cemetery. All throughout, they have these little like reader boards, binders, if you will, talking about different things. Like this is cemetery and monument architecture, so it kind of gives you a beautiful description of what some of the iconography of the monuments here mean, which is so, so cool. There's also a highlight of Adolphus Hyman, who was born in Prussia, trained as a stonecutter in the Prussian Royal Service from 1809 to 1862. So there's a little bit of grave hunting here. Like, they are clearly preserving the history of their residents, which I think is just so, so cool. Also to note, the cemetery is massive. I'm talking massive, which makes sense because there's over 22,000 people buried here, but oh, these are interesting little guys. Look at these little guys. These are little tiny headstones. Biggs, S-A-D. This one is built just right up into the tree base. Can you see that? Like with a lot of older graveyards, unfortunately, a lot of the headstones engravings have been lost to the hands of time. And this is one of those cemeteries where it's prohibited to do grave rubbings. Now, I always say if you're gonna do grave rubbings, make sure the graveyard you are at allows them, because a lot don't. And it's really, really important that we respect that, because these headstones are old. They're multiple centuries old. We want to make sure that they are still around.
Let's take a quick second to highlight some of the historical people buried in the cemetery. First, we have Charles Dickinson. No, not like the author, the guy that Andrew Jackson killed in a duel in 1806 over a little squabble having to do with a horse race. Fun fact, the bullet from Charles's gun stayed lodged next to Jackson's heart for the remainder of his life. Then you have the murder case of Emily Person in 1889, a free African-American woman of 65 who was fatally poisoned by one of her cooks using one of my favorite arsenical substances, the infamous Victorian Raffan Rects. Emily's aunt, Lucinda Bedford, is notably one of the wealthiest freed slaves in Nashville history. Her master gave her $75,000 upon her release, and she would later be buried next to him in this impressive plot. She was also poisoned, however, she survived. Elias and Matilda Polk, former slaves owned by former President James Polk, had their headstones replaced in 2017 in a growing movement to recognize more of the African Americans buried in the cemetery. Elias is known for his great work within the African American Democratic Party, and Matilda was 110 years old when she died.
So you always know somebody is very important to a city when at the cemetery they get a very fancy plaque like this talking about who they are, what they did, and why they're spicy. So this, my friends, is clearly the monument of a mayor, William Carroll to be exact. He was born in 1788, died in 1844, apparently a native of Pennsylvania. William Carroll moved to Nashville in 1810 and apparently was a hero of the War of 1812 and is considered the business governor of Nashville, and apparently was like a great merchant and served longer than any other mayor of 12 freaking years. So this, my friends, William Carroll. What's up, bro? I've just found what has to be one of the coolest monuments I've seen in a cemetery, which is this one. If you can see, it's like two people cuddled on top of this beautiful monument, and it's such a shame because I have no idea. If you can tell, all of the markings are pretty much completely gone. This is the instance in which a grave rubbing would help, but again, this is not a place that allows that, so we are going to respect their wishes.
You guys know this cemetery is reportedly haunted. I wouldn't be sharing it if it wasn't. But my favorite legend or story that I've happened upon came in the Nashville American paper dated April 29th, 1898. And it tells the tale of 3 little girls who discovered a female voice coming from an old crypt. Amongst the sounds of sobs and chains, albeit a little cliche, the girls found their courage and asked this spirit questions. She said she was a Spanish woman who, get this, snuck on board one of Columbus's ships when he came to America and landed in Cuba. The story got out and crowds of people continuously streamed into the cemetery to hear the Spanish ghost. Now, I'm not sure why, but the story has died down and I've only ever found one article about it, but it's still a really good one.
So I have found another one of those really cool, like, reader boards talking about the graveyard. So this one looks kind of like a newspaper on one side. It says, a dreadful malady, death and disease in the 19th century. It's just talking all about the cholera and diphtheria epidemics that swept through here in the 1870s. Hundreds were dying daily, absolutely horrible, but pretty cool cemetery history. Well, I've definitely found my favorite archway to a plot here at the cemetery. Memento Mori. Yes! This place is just phenomenal. It's next to some big mill or something though, so it's quite noisy, which isn't necessarily the most peaceful atmosphere, but it's gorgeous. I'm in a really dense part of the graveyard that I am currently obsessed with. It is just like all of these above ground sarcophaguses, crypts, whatever you want to call them. There's just so many of them and they're so close together. I have never seen this many above ground. Now, mind you, I've never been to Louisiana, so I have not seen the amazing graveyards of New Orleans, but in Paris and in London, you see a lot of this. So this is just breathtaking. It is just absolutely massive with these beautiful trees. Naturally, we have a Tennessee. Found another absolutely awesome monument. This is literally a coffin-shaped monument. Unreal. Unfortunately, again, and even the stone has been carved to look like wood grain, which is so beautiful. But again, the name is carved off. I would love to reading you guys more names of people, but so many are gone because they're so old. So this is a really cool grave. This is the grave of Pamela Ann Kirk, a Scottish woman who came over around the 1850s and founded the first children's school in her house. And she's credited as being the first female business owner in Nashville. So good on you, Pamela. So next to Pamela, there's another really interesting marker. So there's this rock that has this hanging thing, but nothing's actually hanging from it. And what it says, it's Lucy Rollins Steele. She died May 4th, 1847, in a rock placed over her grave by her husband. So my question to this is, what is buried with her that he put a rock on top of her grave so nobody would either A, rob it, or did he put a rock on top of her grave so she wouldn't come out?
Well, creeps, the story of Suicide Rock, or the Ivy Stone as some call it, is pretty controversial. For many years, people said the rock was a piece of a cliff that Lucy's husband had placed on her grave after she committed suicide by drowning in the Cumberland River. Other romantic versions of the story also emerged. Some say she accidentally fell off of the cliff, others say she was pushed. However, the truth is still tragic, yet a lot less juicy. In 1882, the city sexton decided to spill the truth to the Daily American paper and told how Lucy's husband was secretary of the Board of Commissions in charge of the construction of the state capitol. The rock quarry they'd used became a point of interest when Mr. Steele's wife died. He had 8 convicts move a large chunk of ivy rock from the quarry and put atop his wife's grave along with a lantern. So maybe it wasn't a tragic love quarrel that led to a suicide, but the rock, despite the truth being told in 1882, still carries with it the legends of a macabre end.
It is time for me to head back into the Jeep, regroup, have some coffee, warm up. I literally can't even feel my hands. It's so cold and I've been out here so long grave hunting. I am dying. So as you can see, there's a really beautiful home behind me, and that's the Belmont Mansion. We're about to go tour it. It was built in the 1860s. It's considered one of the most beautiful southern mansions in the entire United States. It is like the height of Antebellum South beauty. It was the summer home of Adelicia Ackland, who had a plantation in Louisiana. It's a complicated story. Like with every place we're going to here, you have to take it with a grain of salt. We're gonna have to remember the time period and not excuse any of it, but it's still history I wanna share.
Welcome to Belmont Mansion, an absolutely breathtaking example of antebellum architecture and a true jewel of Nashville. However, the lives of those within the walls of the mansion are a lot more dark. Adelicia Ackland, the woman responsible for this home existing, is one of many layers. Born in Nashville in 1817, she was engaged in her late teens to a man who would die before they could marry. Years later, she would go on to marry a wealthy slave trader and plantation owner, Isaac Franklin. 7 years later, at age 30, Isaac would die, leaving her with an estate worth $900,000 in 19th century money and one of the largest slaveholdings in the country. Not only a widow at 30 or the wealthiest woman in Tennessee, she also had suffered the death of all 4 of their children. She took this time to travel Europe and start collecting one of the largest private art collections in the country that you can still see in the house to this day. She would remarry and build Belmont Mansion. At the time, its purpose was to be a summer home to escape the Louisiana summers. This time, she married Joseph Ackland, and together they would have 6 children. 2 would die, as would Joseph, but not before the Civil War would find its way to their doorstep. Used as a federal base, the house was spared any damage, but the gardens and farms outside saw their fair share of bloodshed and destruction. It's during the war Adelicia would get heavily involved in helping women, whether that be in education or helping wives or daughters of soldiers on both sides of the war locate their missing men. She was also really involved in donating to orphanages. It almost sounds like she was a helpful and progressive woman until you remember that she continued to hold one of the largest slaveholdings in the country, and despite her cooks being the reason her parties went so well, she never did a damn thing to help the abolitionist movement. By the time Joseph died, Adelicia had seen 3 men she loved die, 6 of her kids die, survived a war, but still she remained one of the largest slave owners until emancipation, which leads us to her 4th and final marriage to a Dr. William Cheatham, a physician and head of a lunatic asylum. Their marriage was an unhappy one, and it's at this time Adelicia would leave Belmont for good and move to D.C., where she would die in 1887. The home is now a relic to a darker and much more tragic time in Nashville's history, and some say she never left.
So Belmont Mansion was absolutely unreal. It was the height of Victorian mixed with antebellum South, and I've never experienced a Southern mansion like that, and so I can't quite put my finger on what makes it different than another Victorian home, but it did feel different. Perhaps it was the outdoor-indoor thing. Perhaps it was the fact that they definitely had enslaved people working there. So here's the crazy thing that I'm currently dealing with and I've never dealt with before. I am now feeling this confusing mix of emotions because Adelicia, for a woman in the time, she was rather cool. So now I'm having this real moral dilemma of, is it okay to like a historical person if they were a slaver? And she was a slaver in the very Hamilton definition of the word. So now I'm just having this really strange moral dilemma. So it was amazing, but confusing.
From the freeway, I saw this epic warehouse, and it turned out to be the historic Marathon Motor Works warehouse. From 1907 to 1914, the only cars to ever actually be manufactured in Nashville proper were these gorgeous Marathon motors. Today, there was only about 7 or 9 that remain, 5 of which are on display at the Village. Despite them not being a huge success in their heyday, they are very much a collectible nowadays. The actual former warehouse now houses a bunch of original tools and equipment, a Jack Daniel's tasting room, American Pickers Antique Archaeology, and apparently a few ghosts. Probably in some part due to the case of salvaged shipwrecked items from a fatal crash they just have right there in the hallway.
So not everything always works out like you'd hoped. So I came out to the historic Tennessee State Prison because it looks like a castle and it's the kind of building that I've been wanting to see my entire life, which is these beautiful old stone castle-like asylums, prisons, all those sweet things. It's considered one of the most haunted places in Tennessee. I can't even get that close because it is still considered a correctional facility, even though I'm pretty sure they don't use it anymore. It is from the 1800s. It is phenomenal. I will show you guys as best I can. I've literally pulled over on a road next to some construction equipment that I am not supposed to be next to. Bummer.
The former Nashville State Penitentiary is a thing of macabre dreams. Built in 1898 to replace the former prison that was much too small, was co-ed, and all around horrible, they decided to build a castle-like structure with 800 cells modeled after the famous Auburn, New York prison. Just like that one, lockstep, striped uniforms, single cells, and a 16-hour day of hard labor in the factories to help pay for their incarceration was carried out, along with a designated section for high-security inmates and females. The brand new prison was no vacation though, and executions were plentiful. Morbid fact, until Tennessee became an anti-death penalty state for 2 years in 1913, they executed their inmates on death row by hanging and kept no records, which means we have no idea how many people were hung by the neck until dead at the prison. In 1915, Tennessee once again became a fan of capital punishment and now had a shiny new toy, the electric chair. At least 24 people would die by electric chair before the prison would close in 1992 after lawsuits of overcrowding and poor and dangerous conditions forced them to close the historic prison. Nowadays, it's a haven for ghost hunters and filmmakers. My favorite thing? The electric chair is still just sitting there. To this day, the old prison is considered one of the most haunted locations in all of Tennessee. Well, creeps, the rest of my first night in Nashville was a lot less creepy but uber delish. The fiancé and I decided to check out Opryland and, of course, Hattie B's Hot Chicken, which, yes, is as good as you've heard. Tune in next week for day 2 of Grave Hunting Nashville. Chin chin, creeps.